Everybody. I am happy to welcome all of you, the panelists and the audience, for the program, for the panel discussion on the challenges of gender violence research. So, as all of you know, this is the part of Prajna's 16 days campaign against gender violence. And it is seventh day of the campaign. This is our 11th campaign. We are doing this 11th year. And as all of you know, it starts from November 25th and goes till December 10th. And every day we curate different events on focusing on the issues of gender violence. So you can stay tuned on the calendar and attend the other events which interest you as well. So with that note, I'm also very excited to listen to the panelists. And I hand over it to Dr. Swarna Rajagopalan to take it forward. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this panel that we put together primarily as a pretext for friends to hang out and chit-chat about things that we hang out and chit-chat about anyway. But in the process, we are hoping that the things that each of us has learned over years of doing work in this area, in one capacity or the other, either as academics or as activists or as writers on the issue, that we can bring together things that we've learned that you will find useful as well. So I'm going to do something very quickly. I'm going to introduce all the panelists who are here today, and I'm going to do it very quickly, and then we will share their full bios on the chat as they come up to speak. And I will do this in the order that we decided that they would speak, but bear with me because my windows are disappearing on each other. I click on one and everything else goes away. So with that warning, on our panel, we have Philippa Williams, who's a Reader Associate Professor in Human Geography at Queen Mary University of London. Her research and teaching intersect political, economic and development geography with a focus on everyday political life in India and its transnational community. Dr. Shazia Choudhry is Professor of Law and the Geoffrey Hackney Tutorial Fellow in Law at Wadham College, Oxford. She is also an Associate Academic Fellow and Academic Venture of the Inner Temple. Dr. Nandini Ghosh is an Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. She obtained her PhD in Social Sciences from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai in 2008. Dr. Ruchira Goswami teaches at the National University of Juridical Sciences, Kolkata, where she offers courses in sociology, human rights, gender and law, child rights and film and law. Dr. Supurna Banerjee is not here today. Dr. Girija Godbole is not here today. Preeti Karmarkar has 22 years of experience. Dr. Preeti Karmarkar has 22 years of experience in social development field in the areas of grassroots mobilization, project development and management, M&E policy, as well as investigative research and NGO management with national and international exposure. She is a part of Nari, Samata, Manch and has been for several years. And she's serving as an external member of the Pune local committee this is the Workplace Sexual Harassment Committee now. So with this, I will call the panelists to come up and speak, and they're going to speak for about 5 minutes each before we open it up for discussion.
Okay, can everyone see my screen? No, cool. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? I think
yes.
So. Good, I can't see you guys. So thanks so much, Swarna. It's a real pleasure to be here on this panel. So I'm going to start us off by thinking about research design. And I'm going to pop that into play mode. So I've got 5 main points I want to make, 5 minutes and 5 slides. So I'll try and stick to time. There are 5 things I want to mention. So firstly, number 1 is to know your research context. And I should just sort of preface this by saying that I'm really kind of pitching this to those of you in the room who might be starting out your research careers, maybe writing your undergraduate or master's dissertations, or putting PhD proposals or other funding proposals together for organizations for research. So really sort of trying to put the basics together here. So number one then is to know your research context. This has to be the place that you start out thinking about research design. Different ways that you can do this. Firstly, to think about getting to grips with the literature that exists. So this might be academic literature, but also other reports that exist in the field. So gender violence is obviously at the intersection of lots of different disciplines, thinking about sociology, anthropology, human geography, English literature, or sort of or other Hindi literature or other literature, psychology, media studies, political science. So whichever your discipline is, or whichever area you kind of know, be prepared to kind of think across disciplinary boundaries, to look at other work out there. As well as literature, speak to people, speak to different stakeholders, you might call them. So whether in civil society organizations or people in the community, about your research and ideas, and see if they have any opinions they can contribute, help you shape your understanding of some of the problems. And of course, if you have supervisors or academics you're working with, speak to them, run your ideas past them and see if they can help guide you as well. So if you, once you've spent quite a considerable amount of time getting to know your research context, you should have a sense of what puzzles exist or what problems there are where the questions haven't already been fully formulated or answered. And it's at that point you can start to formulate your own research problem and think about what questions you want to answer. So what questions haven't you been able to answer through reading the literature or through speaking to stakeholders and others. So this can be the trickiest part of research design. It can feel quite stressful trying to narrow down a problem, but you have to sort of take it step by step, think why broadly at the start, but then really trying to find your focus. I recommend no more than 3 research questions, keep it narrow, keep it feasible, and you might have an overarching aim as well to try and hold it all together. In our case, those of us in the room here pretty much were around a table, so academics and civil society organisations speaking to each other about what we didn't know, what wasn't, what knowledge didn't exist, and through that we put together the kind of questions that we needed to answer. Okay, so once you've got your questions, then you need to think about how you're going to answer them, and that's where the methods come in. So what are the most appropriate methods for answering your questions? Obviously, thinking about violence, gender violence, there are different routes here. There are lots of possible methods. You might think about secondary data. So desk-based research, there's lots of statistics you can draw on, whether the National Family Health Survey, the district level household survey, or legal documents, transcripts of court recordings. There's someone's on the line, I think. Media reports.
Mariam, can you mute everybody but the speaker, please?
Yes, ma'am, I just did.
Cool. So you've got media reports, social media, films, art, cultural productions. All of these might constitute really valuable and interesting kind of data you can look at, whether thinking about discourse analysis or content analysis of it. But also there's primary research, so thinking about qualitative data. And here, just to give an example of, say, surveys and interviews. So surveys would be short, well-structured kind of questionnaires, which you roll out with lots of people, whereas interviews might have a smaller sample, be more in-depth, more intensive in their resourcing. But of course, if we're thinking about working with victims and survivors of violence, we have to be super careful to make sure that if we're going to do interviews, that the benefits of the research really outweigh any risks that might be involved in doing that research, whether thinking about kind of re-traumatizing some of the people we speak with. And this is something our colleagues will speak about more later. So like your research questions, with methods you might want to think quite broadly at the beginning, but then really try to narrow down the methods you choose and be extremely careful that you know why each method is important. Can you link it directly to the question that you want to answer? And I think with a really good research design, you'll have a clear thread through the whole project, which will stitch together each of the components, and you can show how they relate to each other and why they all matter. If you can't justify them, then cut them from the design, because anyone that's reading that will recognize that it doesn't hang together tightly. And you don't want to waste your time either with methods that aren't going to kind of get the sort of information that you're after. And of course, then there's also the question of, if you're going to do surveys or interviews, who are you going to speak to, and, you know, and why as well. So be very sure that you know why you're putting your plan together. Number 4, okay, so how will you collect, analyze, and write up your data? Often in the design itself, this kind of tends to get missed, but I think it's really important to have a plan for the analysis at the very beginning of your research proposal. And of course, you need to think very carefully about how you'll collect your data, because if you get brilliant data, but you don't know your way around it and you don't know how you're going to analyze it, it's kind of pointless in a way. You know, you can't really fully translate that into really interesting and accessible reports or dissertation. So think carefully about how you will store your data, give it very clear labels in your filing system, whatever you're using on your laptop or, you know, paper systems. Be very sure to label everything and know where it all is. And do that from the start, because at the beginning it will all seem very manageable, but as soon as your research gets going, it will quickly snowball and you'll find yourselves with a whole load of data, which is hard to navigate. Think about when it comes, if you're using, say, qualitative works, or even documents or interview transcripts, think about coding and theming the documents in terms to try and sort of mark up and sort of get to know the data. So you can code by hand using highlighters and comments. You can code in Word or other word processing software, or you can use specialist software to do this, like Atlas TI or NVivo or Didos, which are available perhaps through your institutions or on the internet. But coding is a really important way of systematically going through your data, creating themes, which will then kind of pop out at you and essentially then write your dissertation or your report for you. Okay, last point, number 5, is what will you do with the research and how can it benefit different groups? Well, the output, if you like, might be predetermined. It might be your dissertation or a report you have to write. Whatever that is, I mean, it's always important to think through, are there other things you should or could be doing with your findings? Are there other groups you could be sharing your data with? And especially if you've worked with different people to produce the research, it's really important to share your findings back with them. And this, it's also really important to think about what's the best way to present the research. Are there maybe shorter summaries you can provide, or kind of a PowerPoint, or a podcast? You know, maybe that's more accessible than having like a 100-page document, which is quite, you know, fine for one audience, but maybe not for another. So do think about your plans for dissemination at the beginning. Okay, so those are the 5 points: context, problem and question, methods, analysis, and dissemination. And if you work through those systematically, you'll find that your research design takes shape.
Thank you, Philippa. We'll hear all the presentations in a row and then go on to discussion. So Shazia.
Right, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Just need to move this along so I can, right, make it bigger. Okay, right, so this is from the research ethics framework that we developed for actually our project. So I just wanted to take out 5 slides, in fact, because we have 5 minutes to talk about in detail, which I think are particularly relevant for those of you who are engaging in research, and particularly where the research participants include survivors of violence. And these research ethics guidelines are based on guidelines produced by the World Health Organization, and also some organisations based in the UK, Women's Aid UK, also informed these guidelines. So I think the most important one is, of course, the need for anonymity and confidentiality. I'm sure you all know this, but just to re-emphasise how important this is. Safe contact details should always be requested, recognising that this has to be anonymous. Also, the need to ensure confidentiality at all times in terms of also your field notes, in terms of any notes that you make online even or save anywhere. And if you are saving them anywhere, they have to be locked away and also have to be in password protected documents. So the need for confidentiality and anonymity is really, really, really important. And explain also to the participant how information about her is actually going to be stored and kept, because the research participant, particularly survivors, need to know also that their information, particularly anything that's going to identify them, will also be kept in a safe manner. So that's one of the most important issues, I think, to think about in terms of ethics. 4 is safeguarding yourself. And again, this is particularly important if you're going out into areas, particularly rural areas, I think, and also areas where you perhaps are new to you, and recognising also that you may experience secondary trauma as a result of this work. And to ameliorate that, one really good way of dealing with that is to participate in regular debriefing, either with your your team, or if you have a line manager, your line manager should be organising this anyway, but should be having a conversation and debriefing, just talking about what came out of the interviews that day. And if necessary, if you feel it's necessary, to consider individual counselling. Violence against women, as we all know, is incredibly traumatic work, and that has to be recognised within the process of research also. And secondly, recognise and assess the risks of engaging in this research, and those risks include threats to physical safety, particularly obviously if perpetrators or perpetrators' families become aware that you are engaging in this research with that particular woman. And that can include unplanned encounters with abusive individuals who object to the study. So you need to safeguard yourself, and in doing that you need to risk assess how you are interacting with the survivor and what risks it may pose to you. And in that sense, this is the next most important slide, is risk assessment, the need to ensure that we do this. I know it sounds a bit strange when we talk about risk assessment in relation to ethics, but it really is part of the ethical framework, in the sense that we have to think about the risk to yourself, but also to the survivor. And so ideally, interviews shouldn't occur in the participant's home if she's still living with the perpetrator. And if there's no other option, then you must discuss with the participant and before your visit how you will deal with either the perpetrator or someone else interrupting your interview. This could be a neighbour, it could be a family member. So in that sense, you have to know before you go into that situation, what is the story? Why are you there? So in a sense, you have to concoct a story well before the interview, so that you're both prepared and you both don't look surprised and give the game away, as it were. You must also consider what you would do if the situation becomes violent or dangerous, which it can unfortunately do in some situations. And so you must also talk to the survivor about the need to ensure her safety, but also your own, and that you may need to call the police if you feel threatened. And that's a tricky situation to be in ethically, obviously, because survivor may not want the police to be involved, but ultimately you have to put your own safety as a priority there as well. So you must discuss with her that if it becomes dangerous for all of you, particularly for you, then you will need to call the police. These concerns can also arise if the interviewing is happening outside of the home. So for example, if you arrange to meet in a local, I don't know, cafe or somewhere like that, or a park, and a neighbour or family member sees you, then you also need to think about that situation arising too. So again, before the interview, talk to the participant about your story. What is your story? You'll need a story for that situation too. So either you're a friend who's visiting, or if it's pretty obvious that you're not a friend, one example might be that you are working for a health service and you're doing a questionnaire, and that's why you're there. Discuss with her what you can do, therefore, to minimise the risk to her after you have left, because you're going to go home, and although the story might have worked at that particular point, she may then have to answer further questions and come under more interrogation, particularly from family and the perpetrator. So discuss with her what you will do in that situation. If she's not believed, what help will she need, etc. And also, again, pretty obvious, but avoid travelling late at night on your own, and always take a mobile phone with you. And of course, I realise there'll be other issues that you need to think about depending on where you are, in terms of whether it's a rural or an urban location. It might be that it's better for you to stay overnight in accommodation nearby, rather than trying to get home if it's particularly far away. So those are kind of practical but very, very important aspects of risk assessment that need to take place. And connected to that is the need to refer for care and support. Now, the World Health Organization guidelines suggest that as a minimum standard, And as researchers, you have an ethical obligation to provide respondents with information or services that can respond to their situation. So it's not a case of just going in, obviously, and you know, getting the data, having the conversation. You also have to think about what information you have been given, and if that means that she needs help and that you can offer her some help or refer her for some help, you should be thinking about that. And in areas where specific violence-related services are available, take detailed directories with you so that you can make those referrals. So it's an active process. It's not just about obtaining information that you need for your research study. It's also providing help where you can, and giving information where you can. So you shouldn't be going into a situation where somebody says, well, actually, I would like to leave, or I would like some support, and you have absolutely no idea what to say because it's not your area. You need to go in prepared. And in settings where resources are scarce or non-existent, refer the participant to interim support measures, such as, for example, counselling. So if you're in an area where there aren't any of those services, but you do know, for example, that there might be a local health service that's providing some kind of care or support, refer her to that. And then finally, the interviews and intervention. I think this is a really, really important aspect of this kind of research, which I think sometimes we forget, and it's actually very, very important. The first point is that disclosure can be an important experience for both of you, researcher and respondent. Research participants welcome the opportunity to tell their stories if they're asked in a sympathetic and non-judgmental way. And this can actually be very, very empowering for women as well to participate in research. I've had experience of that, where at the end of the study, even if it's been anonymous and they've seen their words used in a report at the end of the project, it can be an incredibly powerful experience for them. And they feel very much that they've contributed in some way to alleviate the suffering of other women in the same situation. So very much thinking about the interview as an intervention is really, really important. However, the slight downside to this is that respondents often want to spend time with you after the completion of an interview, talking more, or asking you to interview a friend or relative who they know is in a violent relationship. And you have to consider about what your response will be if this happens. So you have to effectively prepare for all eventualities as a researcher in these situations. And so you might have that happen. What will you do? How will you bring that interview to a close? And I think one of the practical ways of doing that is to make it very clear at the outset how much time is available. So you say, I'll be interviewing you for an hour. Yeah, and making it quite clear that there is a time limit here. Obviously, if you need to extend because of the situation you're in, you can do that. But I think it's quite clear to indicate it's good to indicate right at the beginning that it is time limited, and that if you do get requests for further help or interviewing, that you then obviously arrange to see that person on another day, so you're not doing it all in the same at the same moment. So consider what your response will be. It's also super important to end the interview on a note that emphasises a woman's strengths and to try to minimise distress. There are quite a few other slides that I don't have time to go into, but one of them was dealing with the fact that this is a very, very distressing situation for the survivor to be in, to be giving you this information. It's secondary trauma for her as well. She's having to relive the experiences. So we want to try to minimise distress wherever possible. And also, I think, minimise the number of interviews that you actually do. There's quite a lot of discussion now in the literature on this about whether or not we do need to be interviewing women at all, women survivors of domestic abuse. And that's a question that I think we have to pose to ourselves. It's quite a difficult question as researchers. Do I need to be doing so many interviews? Do I need to do this interview? Can I do this research without these interviews? Because it is very, very distressing for women to participate. And so we have to try to minimise distress, especially as she might have revealed information that makes her feel vulnerable. In the World Health Organization study, interviews in which violence had been disclosed were ended with, from what you've told us, I can tell you that you've had some very difficult times in your life. No one has the right to treat someone else in that way. And many researchers issue small cards that provide information about services and include messages such as, if you're being abused, there are ways out, or violence is never justified. So it's really important. It might seem a bit sort of trite to have these little cards, but you have to remember that for a lot of these women, they may not have ever had anybody actually say that to them, that this is unacceptable, that what happened to them is not right, is terrible, and that no one has the right to treat them that way. And that can be a very, very important intervention in itself, to feel that you have been heard, to feel that you have been seen by somebody, and to feel that you have made some contribution to alleviate the suffering of other women. And I'll leave it there because I think I might have gone over my 5 minutes.
Yes, but thank you, Shazia, because that was really comprehensive and will be very useful. Preeti, you're next.
Okay, yes, Varna. Just a moment, I will share my PPT. I hope that screen is visible. Okay, so thank you, Shazia. Shazia has covered some of the aspects. I will be mainly talking in terms of do's and don'ts while interacting, especially with the violence survivors, because while researching gender violence as such, talking about violence or trauma is itself a trauma again for the interviewee. So there are few tips. Actually, while interviewing the survivor, it is always good to approach the survivors through a local organization. Working with them, so you have something for the support if it is required. Then one needs to schedule the interview at safe place as per mutual convenience. Then one should inform the respondent the approximate time required for the interview beforehand itself, because otherwise they will come with the appropriate time in their hand. Then if the interviewee feels need of someone of her trust, to be with her, then allow the person to be with her while, in the process of interview, but request that person not to answer on her behalf. Then these are some, practical tips, or, I will be talking in terms of do's and don'ts more. So for actual process of interview, please welcome the respondent, then talk slowly and clearly, give them some time to settle and help them to get comfortable. Then explain the purpose of your research and assure confidentiality of her identity as well as the content of the conversation. Then we also need to seek the informed consent and do as per the protocol of the research. You may need to take consent for the interview and for recording also if you are going to record the conversation. And please don't assume that they understand the consent. One needs to explain them clearly what they are consenting to, and of course answer if they have any doubts. Then we need to be patient during the process, because the stories always take time to unfold, and we also need to understand the limits of the respondent. So talking about the trauma is again a trauma itself. So if she gets tired, then please have a small break. Please make arrangement for water, tea, or snacks if required, and also keep the tissue papers with you. And then while concluding the interview, please, thank her and request her feedback about the process. How did she feel about the, after talking to the interviewer, and explain her the next steps, what will happen to the data collected through the process. Then you may need to alert her about the possibility of, surfacing of difficult emotions, and provide her local contacts if required. So that can minimize, the consequences of that traumatic experience of talking about the trauma. Then these are few don'ts in the process. Of course, don't rush a survivor. Do not interrupt her while she's talking. Do not ask questions too frequently. Let her complete, let her talk whatever she wants to. Then do not give loud reactions. If your reactions are loud, that may create discomfort for the interviewee as well. Also, don't look away frequently or don't stare continuously either. We need to maintain necessary eye contact with the interviewee. Then don't get her a feel of interrogation. So be respectful and warm while asking your questions. And we need to be, careful about the things like not to yawn or not to look at the watch. So that may give her the feeling of discomfort. Then don't be judgmental and don't make any of such comment while having interaction. And of course, not to ask any offending questions or not an offending tone during the conversation. And there can be, difficult situations that can arise in the, process. So I have given here just 3-4 examples. We often come across with these situations, especially during the counseling sessions. What if the respondent refuses to talk, or, respondent weeps during the process? So the first thing is that we need to be calm. We need to give them enough time to settle. Then if one refuses to talk, please accept their emotional disturbance, empathize with them, please give them, adequate time to settle, assure them about the confidentiality and clear their doubts. And after, engaging this kind of conversation, please accept whatever decision they have, whether to, talk or not talk. Then it is very likely that the interviewee weeps during the process, because talking about the violent experiences or experiences of trauma is often difficult, and they weep. So give them time, and just limit your reactions by saying that take your time, or it's normal to feel so, and do not stop her from crying, but be empathetic, be with her during the process, but ensure that she breathes normally. She breathes normally and does not bend down. So offer her something for eat or drink if necessary. Then there can be a possibility that the interviewer gets a panic attack. And that can be visible, one can see that with excessive sweating or chills, trembling, or breathing problems or dizziness. So not to be panicked at all if such things happen. Be calm during the process, stay with the person, speak to the person in short and simple sentences so she can understand, she can respond to that. Help slower her breathing by breathing with her, or you can count slowly 1 to 10 to, help her to breathe normally, and offer her water and allow her some time to rest, to get settled. And it also happens that respondent gets angry, or she gets aggressive, or even transfers the aggression to the interviewer. So again, not to be panicked or get angry with her or get into argument. So please allow her to express her feelings, her doubts, whatever her questions are. Try to make her comfortable with logical responses. And again, allow her time to get settled and gently encourage her for further conversation. So these are few, I think, practical tips or practical things that we may need to follow while actually interviewing the violence survivors. Thank you, Swarna and Prajnya team for giving me this opportunity to, engage in this kind of conversation. Thank you.
Preeti, we are so lucky that all of you can come and do this. This is going to be such an invaluable resource. Girija is here, so would you like to come in now, Girija?
Yes, just give me a minute. I'm trying to share my screen. Is it
done?
Can you see it? No.
Yes.
You can see it. Great. Okay. Wait. Just give me a minute. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Varna, for giving me the chance. I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think Shazia has already covered some of the points, so it makes my task easier. Basically, I'm going to share a few points about looking after yourself as a researcher. Because many times we think about the research participants, their safety, their well-being, but in the process, we often tend to forget that as a researcher, there is something that we are also going through. So as we know, researching sensitive topics can be traumatic for both the researcher and the research participant. For the research participant, sometimes the whole research process can prove beneficial to a certain extent, but for the researcher, it can pose considerable challenges. They might experience the distress secondhand by listening to the traumatic experiences of the research participants. And these, the effect of this may be quite profound in some cases, which will result into burnout or secondary traumatic distress, compassion fatigue. Those of us who have done some research know firsthand how important it is to have a very good relationship with your research participant and how important it is for the success of the overall research project. But we also need to remember that this relationship is inherently artificial, and it is basically to get high quality usable data, and it's often temporary in nature. The research with human subjects is also very unpredictable, especially when the research is about the sensitive topic. And how much ever training or guidance you get before actually doing the research, it cannot really prepare us for all the eventualities. So we need to keep that in mind. We may also experience some tension between the personal and professional elements of our lives as we try to maintain some professional distance. Sometimes we get more involved in our research participants during these intensely personal encounters. So we need to keep that in mind, that we need to maintain some professional distance with our research participants. During the interview process, we may also find that we are trying to control our difficult emotions, or at least try to mute them. It is also important to remember that we all know that the domestic abuse is a serious social problem, but at the same time, knowing something and actually confronting something through the data, it's something different. And so the impact of it also will be different. Sometimes listening to the stories of the domestic violence survivors, we may have a feeling of impotency or helplessness that often grips us. And we also need to remember that we may not have the skills or the experience to make their lives better. And for some of us who are doing this kind of research for the first time, it's even more important to remember this. Despite the phases of intense emotional disruption, there will be some periods in your research process when you will feel disconnected from the data. And that does not mean that we are not committed to the research, but it's a very kind of in a way, natural process. And these instances of disaffection can sometimes bring in much needed relief, which allows us to get the job done, that is to get the data. Some of the suggestions. Reflexivity is very helpful to develop our self-awareness of the impact of these traumatic stories on us as researchers. Then, as Shazia also mentioned, regular structured critical reflection helps us to understand our own position as researcher within the research process. And it's especially important to maintain your relational boundaries and to exit the research relationship smoothly. Some of the researchers suggest keeping a journal, a diary, which is helpful to look at the research from, say, in a more detached way to a certain extent. And it also helps us to develop a deeper understanding of what has happened and its emotional impact on us as researchers. Then having a support network of colleagues can facilitate in regular and systematic debriefing, and also process the traumatic testimonies that we keep hearing during the research process. Taking regular breaks, very important. Doing something totally different, totally funny, which is completely disconnected from the research project. It's very helpful to relieve the stress that gets built up. Some of the more practical tips, I think these also have been discussed before. Avoid disclosing too many personal details like your home address or other private contact details with your research participants. Ensure that the interviews are carried out in a public place, and also inform some other adult about your location and return time. If possible, use dedicated mobile phone SIMs for the research, which can be kind of disposed of after the research. Also, be careful not to raise any undue expectations of your research participants. I think Shazia has also perhaps mentioned about this. Then also monitor carefully the interview to assess the emotional impact and the response of the interviewee. I think Preeti has covered this in detail. Discuss with a colleague if you as a researcher feel any emotional distress. Yeah, these were some of the points. Perhaps we can discuss more later.
Thank you, Girija, for literally getting off a train and doing this. Ruchira?
Yes, thank you. Just give me a moment. Can you see? No, it's not screen sharing.
Not yet.
Yeah. Just a minute. Now?
Yes.
Okay, so what I will do in the next few minutes is to talk about the challenges of doing legal research and what are the issues that come here. So legal education, research, training, all of this is very much what we call black letter law and is informed by positivistic training, in the sense law is what is there in the books, right? And that black letter is what we understand and law as doing law. And that means legal research, even if it is around social and economic issues, the research is based largely on case laws, which means judicial decisions, legal commentaries, looking at law commission reports, etc. Now, that is why in India, we see that socio-legal research, which is empirical, where you actually go into the field and conduct qualitative research, is much less done. Within that, working on sensitive areas like violence against women, for example, everybody here was talking about something like domestic violence, but it could also be on rape, marital rape, child sexual abuse. That is extremely difficult to conduct any kind of research around these areas, because as Shazia and others were saying, that it might trigger trauma in the respondent. But doing it in a legal research frame, I think, is more challenging. Most of these areas in which research is done in India uses available official data, NCRB data, which is Crimes in India data, which is gleaned from complaints that are registered in police stations, or the National Family Health Survey data, which is officially understood as the data. Now, unofficial primary data, which is generated by independent research in socio-legal research, is practically non-existent. What do I mean? As an example, say a woman has been raped, but she has never gone to the police, and therefore official data does not reflect the trauma and what has happened to her. And doing research in these kind of areas using or generating unofficial data is very, very difficult and practically not there in India. Oops, just a minute. Why is it not shifting? Can you? Oh, I don't know. Something is happening here. Can you hear
Arrow
me?
at the bottom.
No? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that, sorry. So even if research involves official data, imagine that we are only working with records by the police, there are several obstacles. For example, I'll come to that, which is the case laws of higher courts are available. So if you look at an AIR manual or Supreme Court, Supreme Court cases, those are available. But if one wants to conduct research on what happens to, say, domestic violence victim in trial courts, and you want to have a sense of how many women are going to which court, what is the nature of the data there, we will see that case laws are not updated electronically for all trial courts in all states. And therefore, it will be very difficult to conduct research on any of these sensitive issues in the trial courts. Imagine that, okay, we are working only with data from the High Court and from the Supreme Court. This is empirical research, so we are going beyond the case law. In that case, there are several obstacles to getting permission to access primary court records. One, it is extremely time consuming to get permissions from several kinds of stakeholders, from the committees, etc. Imagine you have got the access. The unsystematic storing of records is going to be the next hurdle, dusting, trying to find out the correct pages in the file. Certain things are missing, and therefore your research is affected. Interviewing judges, judicial officers, lawyers, and court officials is nearly impossible. Perhaps with you can, but you will need a lot of prior permission for that. This is further compounded when research involves interviewing or examining records of other stakeholders. Say we want to work around domestic violence or child sexual abuse, it is not enough to look at the courts, right? So we have to look at the data, talk to police officials, talk to social workers and administrative systems, and we need to get permission from all of this. So anybody trying to do research in this area would have to dedicate, say, clearly a few months for this. Imagine that in spite of the hurdles, we have done all of this, and the research is now ready for publication. There has been difficulty in publishing overtly critical empirical research, at least in the Indian context. Sometimes you have to take out the real critical part of it, sort of make it sound a little less critical, and say that there are nice things going, because when you are critiquing the administrative systems or the judicial systems in an independent research, the possibility of being having to face the ire of the state is pretty high. So we have to fine tune your research and not exactly write into the way that you want it to. Again, if it is research on the court systems, on, say, delays, what is happening to rape victims, why is it taking so much of time, what is happening, secondary victimization in courts, we would need permission again to publish that research. And this point has been covered, so I am not talking so much about that on this, but ensuring the safety of respondents and survivors of violence and researchers. This is absolutely critical when we are doing research on sensitive areas. What is important in the Indian context, that a lot of legal research might be conducted on case laws, etc. As I said, much less on what the survivors are facing. But perhaps there is no research, or I'll be happy to stand corrected, on lives of survivor post-trial. So most of our research is on what the judicial decision was, or how the woman went to the court and she won a case in the court or lost the case. Imagine that she's won the case. Maybe she's gotten victim compensation. Maybe the person has been punished, right? The accused has been punished. What happens to the woman? What happens to the child? So longitudinal research, or what we call follow-up research, is extremely difficult in India. We can't track the victim. We won't be able to track, and that would be that is one area in which there is very little work done. Say, trafficking victims are rescued and sent back to, they are quote unquote rehabilitated. What happens to them after they are rehabilitated back to their village? And finally, socio-legal research focuses more on the illegalities of the system, how there is an informal system in place apart from the formal system, bottlenecks in the system. What should we do so that women can access the courts better? Those kinds of work. There is much less research on how various respondents make sense of the system, or what we call hermeneutics. How is, sort of doing research, what we call really doing critical social science research. How do various respondents make sense of the system? How does their notions of justice work? What is the gap between notion of justice of the survivor and that of the system. Those kinds of work is just beginning to happen in India. There is some critical work that has already emerged, but I think we need more and more work in sensitive areas around violence against women in India, which will talk about longitudinal research and move beyond trying to just map the illegalities or bottlenecks in the system. All of this is going to be difficult, but I think that is where the next course of research should go. Thank you very much, Swarna and Pragya, for giving me an opportunity to share this. Thank you very much.
Ruchira, thank you for waking up in the middle of the night and doing this. Over to you, Nandini.
Thank you, Swarna and Pragya team. This is a very interesting panel, and the discussion has been really interesting. So I will take off from where Ruchira stopped, or what she was hinting at in terms of the agendas of research. And I'll be talking a little bit about how gender violence research has been received in this country. So, if you look at the history of feminist research or women's studies research in India, we know that the Women's Studies Centers started coming up in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So there's a long history till now of, say, nearly about 50 years plus of doing women-centric research. But was this necessarily research that was focusing on gender violence? I'm not too sure about that. So what I would like to place on record is that there has been the funding by state agencies of gender violence research has been restricted in a certain way. There has been a lot of research which has gone into looking at inequities, gender inequities in society, but it has not really looked at gender violence research. So feminist scholars, however, they, despite this lack of funding, as I was saying, have devised very, very innovative ways of researching gender violence research, highlighting the public and then the private forms of gender violence and how this violence was impacting lives of women across the country. However, there have been a lot of barriers that the state or the administration has posed towards this kind of research, and that is what I will be talking about. I will be talking mostly about two aspects of this. One is in terms of funding such research, and second is in terms of allowing such research to happen. Now, when we talk about funding such research by the state, we find that there is kind of what Ruchira was talking about, this larger positivistic framework that we always find ourselves in, as if, the numbers or the quantity justifies the existence of a phenomena. And there is not much substance given to the quality of the violence that is experienced by the women, the quality of the experiences that women have to undergo because of the insidious violence that is there in their everyday lives. So this focus on quantity in a certain way takes away or deters people from engaging into research on lives of women. I mean, when you listen to, say, Preeti or Girija or Philippa or Shazia talking about how we should be so careful and sensitive in researching women's lives, then it becomes very important to think about how, look, each woman's life is important, how each story tells us something about the nature of violence, and also it tells us about what could be done to counter this violence. Then there is the other problem of funded research, state-funded research particularly, is the time-boundedness of it, that, you have 1 year to finish this research, you have 3 months to write up a report, which really doesn't help in terms of exploration of the variety of gender violence that women might be experiencing. So that is the other, I think, the barrier that prevents this kind of research from coming up. And of course, the minimal funding that is given. If you're doing something like, looking at labor inequity, then you will get a certain kind of funding. But if you are doing, if you're a social scientist, a sociologist doing domestic violence research, oh, there is very little funding for it. This is not as important. It's not so relevant to the lives of women rather than bringing them up to the standard of men. And this kind of arguments that are proffered, how is this going to help women in their daily lives? The second part of the state level, as I have highlighted, is the kind of permissions and the kind of protocols that you are required to follow when you undertake this kind of research. And this, I am saying that what Ruchira was highlighting, that when you want to do legal research, similarly, when we want to do, say, domestic violence research, we want to talk to the stakeholders of the state who are responsible for rolling out the acts, the legal provisions for women who face domestic violence, who are also in charge of providing relief to women. We want to approach them and do interviews with them. We find ourselves coming up against barriers by these organizations, by these individuals who say, please get a permission from the state. Because unless the state says yes, we will not talk to you. We cannot share our data with you. And even when you get the permissions, there is always a fear that we will be quoting them, citing them directly. And so there's this kind of, fear of the findings that will come out. And this, they always feel that the fear of the findings, they fear the findings because they think it will reflect on their individual practices rather than on institutional or structural barriers. There's also this tendency to promote, specific kind of findings or focus on very typical issues that they probably can easily address rather than more systemic issues that they would rather push under the carpet and say, well, this is more, more societal and that is not something we can intervene in. So there is this kind of, avoidance of what the findings are going to be what the findings are going to reveal about the state of implementation of policies, of programs, etc. So what is inherently very clearly evident is the fact that there is no spirit of collaboration. If we are taking on a subject of doing, say, gender violence research, why can't we collaborate with state agencies? There is also this tendency to say, okay, we've done enough, there's nothing more that we can do. I mean, we have done so much, see? And the self-congratulatory mode and saying, talking about all their programs, etc., what they are already doing. But conceiving the fact that the data doesn't reveal that. So you may have that the program is supposed to be doing this, we are doing relief for women. But when you ask them, how many women got the relief? What was the kind of relief that was awarded? There is hardly any data to back it up. So they are also kind of, there's a refusal to acknowledge their own shortcomings. There is a reluctance to take up remedial action. So, as if there's a program that has been brought in, that has been implemented, that is the best that could have been done. The fact that it could be remediated, it could be made even better to reach out to women who are facing violence is something that they are not ready to consider. Also, often a lot of people from the state side cite the fact that there is no funding for such programs, or very little funding available for such programs. So there's a shortage of funding also in terms of gender violence interventions, which is why they do not want to allow a lot of gender violence research. So what really this reveals is the fact that there's a larger social mindset that deems that gender violence is a social reality. It is to be accepted. It is to be born. It is part of, say, Indian cultural ethos. It is acceptable. This is also sometimes rationalized, and rationalized by extolling, how women are central to families, how women's capacities are there to bear violence, to bear a lot of things, or to survive even the direst circumstances, kind of rationalizing all this and saying that, well, gender violence research is, minimal gender violence research will do for this. So this is what I wanted to talk about when I talk about administrative barriers, and these barriers come up every time we want to do research on violence against women. I will stop here, and then if there are questions, I'm happy to interact. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandini. Thank you, everybody, actually. You can now put your questions in the chat, but I will be presumptuous and add, while people are typing into the chat, I will. There's one thing that's bothered me all along. Much of my research has been very political sciencey, international relations. The thing that all research projects have in common, which is very inconvenient for researchers, is that the people we interview typically not just haven't read our research design, but they also haven't been trained in research methodology. So the things that we are indoctrinated to do don't really interest them. They will give you appointments as they wish. They will answer questions as they wish. They will violate confidentiality. You say, don't mention people, they will mention people. In the field, how does each of you cope with this when it happens to you? And I see Sucheta's hand is already up. So I will leave my question there. I can always chat with you about this later and go to Sucheta. Do you want to unmute and speak?
Yeah,
I want
can
to
you hear me?
take the opportunity, Sucheta, to say that Sucheta was our Rajaram Fellow 2 years ago and did a project on curative violence for us. And the Rajaram Fellowship will be announced again soon. So do keep an eye out on our website.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just had a couple of questions. My first question was that now that I am doing a research project on violence against girls, I have noticed that this
Sucheta, it's breaking up. You
notion
may be
of
better
history
off
a
typing. You may be better off typing because we can only hear every few words.
Okay. Is it audible now, or I can just type it? It's fine.
Yes, now it is. Speak.
It's better. I just wanted to know that this concept of privacy seems to be a very urban concept, like it's very rare.
Sucheta, you've trailed off again. We can't hear
Women
you.
even want to speak to me. I'll just type actually. I think that's fine.
Do that because I know where you are. The connection is usually bad.
Yeah.
Sucheta is now working on a project in the mountains. All right. Are there other questions, or you can answer mine to warm up? So
I don't know. I think, should I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Shazia.
Oh, I thought I couldn't see myself. I think I caught half of that question. I think where she was getting to is about the concept of privacy and it being quite urban. And the detail you just gave about her doing a study in the mountains makes me think, yeah, that must be really, really challenging. How do you do that? But I guess, I mean, my question would be, well, how are you doing the research in the first place on violence against women in a situation like that? So there must be some negotiation that's taken place. There must be some realization that's taken place that in order to have that conversation in the first place. So you have to work within the parameters you have.
I think she's typing up her question more fully, so we can wait for
see it.
Just to respond to what I could gather from her, what she was saying about concept of privacy being very urban. I agree that we are more or less guided by the concept of privacy, as it stem from the urban ideas or something like that. But many a times privacy can be survivors see privacy in terms of their safety. So that is, most of the concern for them. So rather than privacy, it is more of a safety. That's what I could, comment on this from my experience.
Would any of the others like to comment on any of this or on each other's?
I think someone's got their hand up. Esther.
And I had a question. Yes, I had a question too. Don't forget that, Esther. I was going to encourage people to type first because given how the connections are, but if we can hear you, Esther, go ahead.
Okay, fine. Thank you. I mean, it was an excellent presentation from all the panelists of this afternoon session. My question is like for example, it's really very difficult for women to really unpack and talk about their personal issues. So I just would like to know from their perspective, like how ethical it would be, like let's say for example, like we are intervening with the survivors of violence, both I mean there are different forms of violence, like and violence experienced in the private sphere and the public sphere, and the different forms of violence that women go through. So after our intervention in terms of raising awareness, then get on to like to make them talk about their experience of having underwent this violence, and then do this empirical research, how ethical it is. Just want to know. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, how ethical is what, just to clarify?
How ethical is it to do research on gender violence if women are reluctant to speak? Did I understand? And
no, not only reluctant, it's basically like we have our intervention and like empower them to speak about it, then subsequently carry on their empirical research, document their lived experiences and bring it out.
Okay, so I think it's just a sort of conceptual, yeah. So yeah, I mean that I think as long as you're following an ethical framework, it can be done. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have to use this data. We wouldn't have to put women through this. But the fact is that we do need the data to demonstrate what needs to be done to help women like that. So I think we have to, I think you can do it in a more ethical way. I think it is possible to do this kind of research in an ethical manner. I think it's important to do this kind of research where necessary, which is why I think I raised that in my presentation, that you need to check, and do we need to have this interview? If the work has already been done in the field. And this is why literature reviews are really, really important as well before you start embarking on any field work, particularly with survivors. If that work has already been done, if you're not going to add anything to literature, then why don't put women through interviews? That's the first thing I say. And then if there is a need to do it, you have to ensure you do it in an ethical way. And we've all talked about that in our presentations. I would also add that as I've said, it is empowering for women as well to participate in research. It can be really empowering. And the key to that is to build up a trust and a rapport between yourself and the woman. So she understands and she places trust in you. And that is really, really important. And it's really, really difficult for women to do because often they've had very bad experiences in trusting people. So it's really, really crucial that you approach the survivor in the right and ethical way. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I guess I'm saying it can be done in an ethical way.
Yeah,
Philippa,
thank you.
You have your hand raised.
Me, Swana.
Yes, you had your hand raised.
I did, but it was connected to your question, really. So I don't know.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Then is it okay if we wait on that, because I have two others in the chat and we can just chat about it later. Meghna wants to know, how do we navigate through ethical issues when the participants are young and not above 18 years of age? Wouldn't having a parent guardian influence their responses? And maybe Ruchira can also come in on that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a far more critical question when we are interviewing children as opposed to interviewing adults, and we have to keep all of this in mind of what should be the additional ethical safeguards when we are talking to children. and there is a process of doing it. But definitely having a parent during the interview process is problematic, because that will clearly influence, in most cases, would influence what the child is saying. If say we want to talk about, say, domestic violence in children, then clearly having one of the parents during the interview process is just not helpful. But we have to, as interviewers, as researchers, we have to figure out if this is going to make the life of the child far more difficult. So for organizations and institutions that work with children directly, one way is to go through organizations that work with children, speak to them whether it's going to be okay to interview some children on a particular issue. The other is that while we say that it is, children is anybody under 18 years of age, we also need to figure out what is the capacity and whether the questions are age appropriate. So it's possible for adolescents to answer, like 15, 16-year-olds or anybody who's, in the late teens. It's possible that they for them to answer, they are far more, they're far clear about what they want to say, So just to say that that anybody under 18 can't be interviewed is not the way. It's far more difficult interviewing very little children. So I'm not sure how, as researchers, we can talk to 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds. There are ways, and you need to have to continuously talk and have on board, say, child psychologists. That's something that when we do research, social legal research with children on critical, sensitive issues, it's a good idea to have not just one interviewer from one background, but actually have a psychologist, somebody who's specialized in, say, child psychology, to be on board and pose the questions in a completely different way, and perhaps work with older children is possible, because you don't need parental consent all the time, though it is quite a difficult thing to get parental consent. Maybe through the school, maybe through NGOs is one way of doing that, I think.
Thank you. Shazia, do you want to add to that? Your hand is raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it really depends on the topic that you're interviewing children about, their age. There's lots of variable factors here that are really so clearly, if you're talking about sexual abuse, you need to have very clear guidance on what you're doing and who's in the room with the child, and depending on the age as well. In England and Wales, for example, we have the concept of Gillick competence. So if a child is above the age of 11, then generally speaking, they can consent to all sorts of treatments and also participate in studies like this. But again, it's always good to have what we'd probably call an appropriate adult in the room, so somebody that the child trusts. So it doesn't, clearly not the parent, but maybe a teacher or somebody that they feel they can trust, or I don't know, parts of an NGO. But there is specific guidance that has been issued by lots of organisations, particularly in relation to how you should interview children and their experiences of abuse. I'm just going to put into the chat, this is just a general model that's been developed by Laura Lundy. It's called the Lundy model. I've put a reference in there, which is really great just in general. It's guidance on child participation. So if anyone's doing work on research where you want children to participate and to be heard, it's a general framework that's been developed, that's been picked up by the European Commission as well. So it's a really good model. So I'll put that in there anyway if anyone wants that to have a look at it later.
We have a question from Sucheta, which I don't think is the one she started out to ask, but could I have any suggestions, she asks, on how to interview women with intellectual disabilities? And then she says, I have a case study, but it is very customized to that person and is different from the questionnaire for the other people.
Can I?
Yes, please, Nandini. I was going to ask you.
Hello, Sucheta. How are you? I guess this is for your PhD project, this research that you are doing?
Postdoc.
Postdoc, okay. my suggestion would be that first you do the case study, you collect all the information, you get to know the young women, and then as you proceed to know her well, you will be able to figure out how to pose the questions that you want to pose. For example, if I can say, like, you can use, it will depend also on the intellectual capacity of the woman. So, and the ways, the strategies that you can devise of communicating with her. You can use pictures, you can use other kinds of formats that help you to communicate with her, specifically around the area that you want to talk to her about. So that would be, I mean, it would have to be a case specific way of doing it. You cannot standardize it, because people with intellectual disability are always on the spectrum. So what works for one may not work for the other. So as you proceed to do the case study, you will be able to better figure out what other strategy you might use to interview her, or whether it would be like, 2 questions on one day, 3 questions the other day, using one format on one day, the other format on the other day, to elicit the information that you are seeking. I don't know whether this helps. Ruchira, would you like to add?
Yeah. No, that's fine. I mean, absolutely. No,
I'm speaking with a mute button. No, I was going to say I can connect you and Sucheta, so she can ask you down the line as well. We have a question.
We are connected, Swarna. We have
you are very
connected.
Good. Oh, very good. Okay. I have a question. We have a question from Sahana here. I hope this does not come off as inappropriate, but as you all mentioned, we shouldn't interrupt a person while they are telling their story, especially since it is so sensitive a topic and traumatic for them. But how do you navigate the conversation or gently explain to them if they are exceeding a time or going on a tangent, for example? Also, could you talk about any trigger words that one must avoid, or something that one may not realize is insensitive? And here, after the panel speaks, I'll also ask Sudha to come in, because she's doing the interviews. She's doing interviews with the survivors. So
can I just start, and maybe
please
others
do,
can
please
add?
Do.
If someone is going off on a tangent, then you have to gently bring them back, maybe ask the question again to refocus them. If they are going off on a tangent, or repeat the question again and say, I was wanting to know more about this, rather. So this is the way to bring them back if they are going off to another area. About trigger words, I cannot really say, because different words could be triggers for different people, so it wouldn't be again very uniform. But to use more non-value based words, or non-judgmental words. So instead of saying, you could say, can you tell me what happened to you, rather than, what is the violence you faced? So this is the using more neutral kind of terminology. About exceeding the time, I really don't know, because sometimes I have personally felt that we need to let the women speak their stories. So sometimes they do exceed the time, and we concede to it, because as feminist researchers, we also have to be sensitive to the needs of the women to, speak. And so you might not be able to. I don't think ideally we should be stopping them. Rather, we have become more circumspect nowadays. We schedule less interviews on a day, so that we have more time with each person.
Yeah, I would just like to add, I totally agree with Nandini about the, use of words that may trigger the difficult emotions. I agree with Nandini that it is highly subjective in nature. So it is very, very person specific what would trigger, her difficult emotions. But I think not just words, even our reactions. That also matters. So we need to be very empathetic, sensitive, gently speaking, and using the neutral language as much as possible, and avoiding giving loud reaction is very, very important. That may create a lot of discomfort while talking in the interviewee, and may spoil the entire conversation. So I think these small things really matter on the part of interviewer as well. Thank you.
Sudha, do you want to say something? Yeah, Shazia?
If Sudha wants to speak, does Sudha want to speak?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, agree with all of that. It's really hard to stop women. As Nandini was saying, as feminists, we shouldn't really be, we should let women speak their truth. But sometimes we have to have time constraints, and I think in some respects, so I think body language can be quite important as well. If you know you're towards the end of the interview, and it's more that she just wants to carry on the conversation, to carry on that sort of interaction with you, rather than the data as such, then body language can be quite important. So, kind of shifting back, looking like you're ready to leave, that goes kind of quite obvious things, but sort of, sitting up in your chair, making it clear that, you're towards the end, maybe, that kind of thing can help. But I agree, when you're right in the midst of getting the, getting the data and getting the information, it's really hard. Yeah. Sorry, Sudha.
Sudha may have had to step away for a minute. So we'll go on to Sucheta, who did type in her first question, whether it was okay to interview women in the presence of their family, if that is what they want.
Can I come in? Yes. No, I mean, Sucheta, while we respect the agency and the autonomy of the respondent, and we need to be sensitive to what she wants, as a researcher and for the purpose of research, which I think should be a priority as a researcher. And we have had this discussion in this group, and we sort of said that it's not a very good idea to have to interview the woman in presence of family members. Apart from the fact that we are trying to do the interview in a site which is not her familial space. If it's, say, an interview in domestic violence, then doing it within her home is not the ideal space. So ideally, it should be conducted in a neutral space. So that will sort of take away that concern that family members are constantly sort of be present in the room. Now, if she herself wants a family member, then as a researcher, I think we need to weigh it out. I mean, whom does she want? Maybe just try and figure out why she wants this person to be with her. And I think it was said earlier that even if for support she wants, say, another woman from the family to be with her when she's interviewing, that person should not answer or on her behalf, on the respondent's behalf. And the body language should also not be such. I mean, I'm just taking a cue from what Shazia is saying. Maybe you are this bystander with the respondent, but sometimes, what we call bystander language, that this person who does not say anything, because as a researcher, we have said, like, please don't speak, allow only the respondent to answer. The body language of this bystander can also be difficult. So I think as an interviewer, as a researcher, we have to be careful as to whom we are allowing to come with the respondent, and what is the body language, what is the cue that this other person is giving. And ideally, if possible, to conduct the interview in private, for which I think we need that space, something that Nandini was saying. We need to give a little more time, perhaps in the beginning, or the previous day, if it's possible, to have a conversation over the phone. So to have some little grounding before she starts speaking to a complete stranger. So I think breaking the ice would need some time, but it's worth giving that effort than sort of, I think, disrupting the, quote unquote, disrupting the response by the presence of another person. So, you know, even if she wants, I think we need to clearly tell her that, and that is something that we discussed in the project that we are doing, that we are not, you know, sort of catching anybody unawares. We are telling them as much as possible that this would be on a one-to-one basis as much as possible.
Can I just add a qualifying question though, before Shazia comes into answer? We are accustomed to talking about domestic violence, but what if what Sujata wants to ask about is street sexual harassment, which, you know, then absolutely, would it be okay to have a mother or a cousin or an aunt in the room?
Yeah.
And then Shazia can come in and you can pick that up.
Oh, Ruchira.
Yeah, no. I mean, you can take it up. I was just saying that I think this is not particular to domestic violence research alone. We are just using that example more, but even if it is street harassment or harassment at workplace, I think the same things apply. I mean, if necessary, so if, say, we are talking about sexual harassment and the daughter talks about sexual harassment, and if you want to expand the interview base, that has to be done through methodology, that we also speak to the mother separately in terms of, say, how she is responding to the sexual harassment. So it's not necessary that you just need to have one respondent from one family, but to treat each one of them as separate respondents, I think would yield better data. Though in certain cases, if it's a homogeneous group, then I think also focus group discussions work. So if I have a bunch of young students who all want to speak about sexual harassment, right, on streets of India, and it's possible that we have figured out who these 10 respondents are, and there is some level of homogeneity, then perhaps a focus group discussion, which is structured, which is semi-structured, which is organized well, can also yield a lot of data. We need to look at power hierarchies. I think that's the cue, you know, what is the power equation between the respondent and the person who's with the respondent? I think that is what I wanted to say. Yeah, over to you, Shazia. Yeah, please.
No, that's all right. We did have quite a lively discussion about this, if I recall correctly, in our team meeting about it. But yeah, so I think, first of all, interrogate why the person is there. It could be for negative reasons, control and power, which we need to be really, really aware of. And I think in that sense, I think we discussed this as well. Obviously, you've got to take her word for it, but I think you've got to then do continuous consent. So if you're coming up to a particularly tricky area where you're going to start talking about perhaps if it's sexual violence, or, you know, it's going to go into quite detail, check again with her whether she's okay for that person to be there, because by that point, both parties might be reassured, if it's a family member, that this is not some kind of horrible situation for her to be in. She may feel much more comfortable with being interviewed on her own. So the kind of continuous consent model is also very good in terms of checking again, you know, would you be happy to continue on your own now? Would you rather, you know, your mother stepped out at this point because you know, it's difficult for people to talk about things like this, even if they've got a very supportive parent or sister or whatever sitting there. You know, it's hard for them to hear about things that have happened to their sibling and to their child. So I think the continuous consent model can really, really work. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Yeah, and I think it's often good to have that conversation in front of the person as well, which is, well, you might have said to the woman, well, I want to have this conversation, and it's one-to-one, and she said, well, I have to bring my mother-in-law. It could be something horrific like that, you know, in which case, in front of the mother-in-law, you say, well, actually, this interview should really be one-to-one, but, you know, if you'd like to come in for the first few minutes, so you take that responsibility for that decision away from the survivor. Because I think you all know, you can sense when something's going on that's a bit, as Ruchira was saying, there's a power dynamic going on there. And I think that's when you step in and you try to take the responsibility away of that decision away from the survivor by being quite sort of assertive on her behalf and saying, well, actually, this is something that, you know, if you feel that you can say, is there a reason why you particularly want to be in? Would you like to be in for the first 5 minutes? And sort of say it like that. And then, you know, at the end of the first 5 minutes, I'm just going to check in with both of you, and we'll continue the interview on its own unless there's a reason why you feel that you need to continue. So I would do something like that. If I felt that there was some kind of weird dynamic going on, I would probably just launch in like that and just say, right, so you're okay to go in for the first 5 minutes because I understand you might want reassurance, etc. However, after that, the interview will continue on its own if you feel that's the dynamic. So I think you've got to see how it plays out, really. But if it is a kind of genuine supportive thing going on as well, you know, you've got to respect your autonomous choice. But again, I would do the continuous consent model, because actually it can be quite burdensome for survivors to talk about, you know, very difficult situations that they might not even have told their family members about. You know, not even said out loud. So the idea they're going to say that in front of a sibling or a mother is very, very hard for them as well. So I think, again, do that continuous model. That was it. Oh, sexual harassment question.
We have...
yeah, I agree with Ruchira. I agree with Ruchira on that. That's
I just wanted to say we're officially over time, but can we take another 10 minutes? We have one last question in the chat, and I would actually like you all to answer it in your way. Is it okay to define violence in accordance with women's own notions of what violence means to them? And I think that's a really good closing question. And Girija, you are leaving, so why don't you start and then leave? Your video was off most of the time, so it was hard to find you on the screen. So we'll start with you and then go around.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was like...
Yeah.
Is
it okay to define violence in accordance with women's own notions of what violence means, as opposed to going in with our definition and...
Oh. Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we want to get their opinions, their views about what violence is, I think in some ways it's better to kind of go without a... Are you showing me something? No. Okay.
No.
Okay. I think it's in my view, I think it's quite interesting to go without a definition in some sense, because then we can be more open to understand what do they think about violence. I mean, of course, I'm not saying that as researchers we are value neutral and all that. I don't believe in that. But what I'm trying to say is, I think if we are more open-minded, then we can be more receptive to their ideas of violence. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and then you could
add. Yeah.
Okay. I'll wait for 2-3 minutes more.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with Girija that we should, understand what her notions of violence. But I think that, this is feminist engagement for us as well. So we should be open to understand her notions of violence. But I think we should also be able to inform her, what the violence means legally, or whatever the accepted definition of this. Because many a times women do not recognize that whatever is happening them is violence. So I think, as as a part of our feminist engagement, it is better if we inform them with that kind of thing. And in present research in our hand, we have developed a kind of a write-up on that. What is the definition of violence and where they can find some help or information about it. So I think that should be our rule. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think, can I just quickly say, I agree with Preeti, we should take this as an opportunity to start the discussion, because many times patriarchy works in so many subtle ways that they themselves may not see many things as violence. So I think this may be an opportunity, as she is saying, this sort of research.
Who would like to pick up the question next?
I can, because I've got to go as well, I'm afraid. But yes, I think yes, absolutely. And you can learn more about people's experience of violence as a result. So in itself, I think it's really, really valuable. And as feminist method, I think it's very much about listening to women and reporting what women's experiences actually are and their lived experience. So I don't have an issue with that at all.
Philippa, Ruchira, Nandini.
Yeah, I mean, I can just chip in really, but building on what's being said. I mean, I think absolutely, if you start with your interviewee's perception of the question and defining the topics that you want to examine. I think that's an excellent way to begin. And not least because it can reveal much about the kind of cultural or social norms, which are kind of shape people's opinions. So exactly like Girija was saying around, say, patriarchy or misogyny that might be underpinning why a woman would see something as violence, but maybe not another action. So I think that would be really, really interesting to kind of get a sense of distinguishing the boundaries around how violence is perceived. But absolutely, I think here, as Preeti rightly pointed out, there are limits to, especially if say a woman doesn't recognize kind of violence in the way that is recognized by the law, but also more widely as well. So maybe if it's emotional, psychological violence or economic violence that might be more invisible, then it's super important as the researcher to find a way to intervene and to offer, as we are trying to do in our research, to offer counselling and further support, flagging up networks or organisations where they can kind of seek wider support around violence. So making that interaction a kind of informative one, a kind of a point of intervention, as well as purely kind of seeking data or whatever. And I think as well, Swana, your question was earlier, and we kind of talked about it, or you guys talked about it. And I guess much of the research I've done has been in the ethnographic context, which is one in which very much you fit in the research environment, rather than kind of being dictated by timetables and how many interviews you've got to get done in that day. And I would be quite inclined to say that the interviewee needs to really kind of lead in many ways in terms of what they're comfortable and able to do. And if they do want to keep talking, then that's kind of, you have a responsibility to enable that and not to cut them short. But of course, there are sensitive ways of kind of guiding and steering a conversation. So yeah, just to add.
Ruchira, Nandini.
Yes, very quickly, it's I agree with everybody else. But I was just thinking the reverse. It's possible that the woman recognizes a kind of violence which is not resonating with the social reality around her. And while law acknowledges that violence, if we look at data, we will see women are not going in there to report a lot around, say, economic violence. But the law recognizes economic violence. And the woman, not knowing the law, also thinks that what is happening to her is violence. So I was just thinking, if it's the reverse, then should we take that as a starting point? And I think that's also an excellent starting point. And to map the kind of gaps between law, social understanding of violence, and a survivor's own sense of violence. So I think any research starting with what the person thinks is violence is a fantastic starting point, because it is just not a starting point of doing interview. It's not just ice breaking. I think it's a methodological question, as much as it's an ontological and epistemological question, the whats and the whys. And I think any feminist research should start from what the respondent thinks about it. And over a course, I think what it reveals is because feminist research is also reflexive. So maybe, what I'm taking off from what Preeti is saying, maybe as feminist researchers, what we think is violence is not corresponding to what the women we are interviewing think is violence. So what should be our role in there? And the gaps between feminist understanding and the social reality is also something that informs our research. So all of these experiences should find its way systematically as data in the research that is produced. I think that is important.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to say, I think. The fact is that we always say that we start with what the interviewees are saying, our research participants are saying, but also as a part of the feminist research process, as Ruchira was saying, reflexivity, but also of consciousness raising. So we begin with what the women are saying. We try to process them, also analyze them, try to fit them into the what is there as existing research. but then we also pose to them further questions about, why don't you think that this is violence? You know, you're saying this is violence. Why do you not think that this also is violence? And this is the process of consciousness raising that we continuously engage with when we are doing feminist research. So we begin with them and we also come back to them and tell them, this is what we have thought about and do you agree with it? So that is this entire process of going iteration and reiteration that we talk about. And I think that is one of the core strengths of feminist research.
Well, on that note, I'm going to wrap up this panel. Thank you very much, all of you, for taking the time to prepare, and for all of the people who came and attended. We will have the recording up in a few days, or faster if we can. But I want to say that, you know, it really does bother me, and it always has from the time of my PhD research, this distance that there is between the research design on paper and our experience roaming around the real world, which when you're the only researcher, then you kind of make your own adjustments and compromises, and you realize over time that they're kind of inevitable because, as I said, people don't read the script you wrote for them. But I wonder about it all the time, and I wonder about how that alters, you know, how open are we about these changes that do take place between the start and the finish, and, you know, where we wanted to go and where we ended up going. All of these things are often almost as interesting to me as the original research project itself. And I'm sure we will have many opportunities to discuss this as time goes by. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate that. Philippa, did you raise your hand? I should do that for all of you and Sudhir, over to you, because you have the important job of.
Yeah, thank you so much for all the panelists, and also, I mean, it is a very enlightening and empowering presentation, and also followed with rich discussion as well. So it end up the like what to say, it's a more fulfilled day. I can say, like, it's yeah. So, and also, like, you know, we will be having a group photograph after the event.
Please turn on your
So
videos.
can you turn on your videos, please?